Hey everybody, welcome to the Briefing Room. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Great to have you with us on this Wednesday. The President of the United States is visiting with victims today from two of those mass shootings over the weekend in El Paso, Dayton, Ohio, and stirring up some controversy along the way. Protests greeting him in both places. Officials, lawmakers, city officials in both places saying the President is both welcome there, but also a lightning rod for some of the controversy around his rhetoric that some are saying contributed to these violent acts. We'll get into more on that, some of the controversy around his visit today coming up. But first, moments ago, families in the community in El Paso were coming together as the President of the United States makes his visit, and our Marcus Moore was there, brings us inside that rally. Hey, Marcus.
I'm Marcus Moore in El Paso, Texas, where we are covering the aftermath and the response to that massacre that happened over the weekend that left more than 20 people dead at a Walmart. And we are at Washington Park here in El Paso, where hundreds of people have gathered to speak out against hate, as you hear the young woman saying on the stage there. We anticipate that Beto O'Rourke, the former congressman who is from El Paso, will be speaking, as well as current Congresswoman Escobar. And this is what we have seen in response to the President's planned visit today. He's expected to visit the hospital, which you can't see it from here, but it's off in the distance, where a number of people have been recovering from their injuries from this shooting. But you can see all of the people who have gathered here, many of them with signs. They come here with their friends and family, and it really is quite a crowd here that's taken over this baseball field. And you can see the flags and also the signs there. Many of the signs talking about President Trump. And there's a lot of anger here that has followed the sadness after the shooting. Many people here are angry that the President is coming to El Paso because they feel like his rhetoric played a role in the shooting that happened on Saturday. And that's one of the reasons why you see all of these people here, men, women, and children, who have come out here to have their voices heard and be a part of this rally that once again the organizers have described as an anti-hate and an anti-gun violence rally. That's why they're here. They are desperate for a change, and they're hoping that lawmakers will hear their voices as they continue the process of trying to heal from Saturday's massacre. I'm Marcus Moore in El Paso, Texas, and you're with ABC News Live.
All right, thanks to Marcus Moore there. It is clear that the President has heard these demands for action. Before leaving for Ohio and Texas this morning, he spoke to reporters on the South Lawn and said he's looking at bringing people together to take some action on background checks. Here's what the President said.
Well, I'm looking to do background checks. I think background checks are important. I don't want to put guns into the hands of mentally unstable people or people with rage or hate, sick people. I don't want to, I'm all in favor of it. Well, I can tell you that there is no political appetite for that at this moment. If you look at, you could speak, you could do your own polling, and there's no political appetite from it from the standpoint of legislature, but I will certainly bring that up. I'll bring that up as one of the points. There's a great appetite, and I mean a very strong appetite, for background checks, and I think we can bring up background checks like we've never had before. I think both Republican and Democrat are getting close to a bill to doing something on background checks.
All right, let's bring in our White House reporter Jordan Phelps now for a little bit more on this. Jordan, the big question here is, what does the President actually mean when he says he wants background checks? Of course, background checks are currently the practice for most gun sales. There's been talk of expanding them. There's been talk of beefing up the background check system. But he's very ambiguous here. We've heard this from the President before, but not a lot of leadership. Any clarity from the White House?
Devin, it's significant just to hear the President today saying that he is in favor of background checks, because it was unclear for much of this week whether he was in fact in support of that. Remember, on Monday morning, he tweeted out that he wanted to see background checks expanded, but then he made no mention of it in his address to the nation, hadn't brought it up since. So the President there saying something specific he'd be willing to get behind in terms of legislation. So that counts for something. But Devin, it isn't clear exactly what the White House is talking about. We've heard them mention a lot specifically these red flag laws. So it's unclear if perhaps the president is conflating those two issues, but we do know that President Trump had conversations with Senators Manchin and Toomey, who are leaders on gun reform on Capitol Hill, and specifically for a bill that would reform the system of background checks to include some loopholes that are currently excluded, like gun shows, internet sales. So there's some openness to that idea potentially. But Devin, the president said that he is in the midst of conversations with leadership in Congress, and he said he'd be willing to call back members of Congress from their August recess if they're able to get close to a deal. But Devin, you're right to point out that the president has said this before. He said he's in support of background checks, but it hasn't led to any legislation ever passing, at least not yet.
Or even any meetings or gatherings or any sense of urgency. One usually would look to the President of the United States to lead on something like this. The President's words carry a lot of weight, certainly with his own party in the Senate. Jordan, he did get an earful from a Democratic senator there in Dayton, Ohio. Sherrod Brown of Ohio caught up with President Trump on the tarmac. He was there to greet him, said it was important to have a bipartisan showing today, but he did deliver a message on background checks and other gun legislation. Here's what he said he told the president.
Both the mayor and I asked the president to call on Senator McConnell to bring the Senate back in session this week, to tell the Senate that he wants the background checks bill that has already passed the House, that he wants it on the floor. I asked the president to promise to me and to the American people that he will sign that bill after he's spoken out in support of it with Senator McConnell.
And Jordan, back to you on this, because as Senator Brown pointed out, the president hasn't actually said he would sign any specific legislation, and he's sort of equivocated on this idea of urging Mitch McConnell to bring the Senate back or to take some steps. You've talked to Kellyanne Conway about that.
Yeah, Devin, it's really unclear at this point. We've obviously seen the president call for bold action before, especially after Parkland. He even entertained ideas as dramatic as an assault weapons ban, but then the president met with the NRA leader and that kind of fizzled. So it's unclear at this point if there is anything specific that the president is behind here.
And Jordan, before we let you go here on the president's trip, the president, we should say, has been meeting with families. He visited a hospital in Ohio. He's meeting with the families in Texas as well, in both places being kept away from the cameras, doing this in private. And in fact, the mayor and the senator said the president was greeted respectfully. It was appreciated that the office of the president was there. But there's been some controversy now this afternoon after what the president's social media director and spokeswoman have tweeted about this visit.
Yeah, Devin, it was just minutes really after they left that Dayton hospital that they were back on Air Force One, and we saw a series of tweets fired off in attack mode from the president's director of social media, Dan Scavino there, and Stephanie Grisham, the White House press secretary, accusing these two politicians of mischaracterizing the president's visit, saying that the president got a hero's welcome essentially inside that hospital. Number one, Devin, it's hard to check that since the White House didn't allow any cameras in. And number two, this is coming as the president is there meeting with those in mourning, those grieving. And so there's sort of a disconnect here between, again, that message of unity and being the consoler in chief that the president is putting off officially. And then on board Air Force One, his staff are tweeting off things like this. And the president, I should note, also tweeting that he was watching Joe Biden's speech and calling it so boring.
A lot of divisiveness in politics, at least from the White House side of this. And we should say, for the record, we covered the entirety here on ABC News Live of Senator Brown and Mayor Whaley's press conference, and at no time did they suggest the president was unwelcome today. In fact, Mayor Whaley had this to say about how the president was received inside that hospital.
I think the victims and the first responders were grateful that the President of the United States came to Dayton.
So some gratitude there, for the record, certainly dissonance with what was tweeted. Thanks to Jordan Phelps for that. Moving on now, as we learn new details about the motives in both of these shootings over the weekend, there are new questions about what law enforcement knows about these troubling trends, two troubling trends that are reflected in both of these killers and in both of these cities. Our Pierre Thomas, Chief Justice correspondent, is here because, Pierre, you pointed out here in the newsroom last night, sort of struck a lot of us that while while we are sort of lumping these two shootings together for the devastation that was waged by guns, they're actually very different and very concerning trends in both instances.
Exactly. In terms of El Paso, what you saw in Gilroy, you had what they think are two pretty clear-cut acts of domestic terrorism. Both are being investigated as such. And then in Dayton, the police came out yesterday and said that he was obsessed with previous mass shootings. And I can tell you that that is an ongoing phenomenon that we're seeing over and over again, where mass shooters are looking at the work, studying the work of previous mass killers and trying to emulate it and sometimes outdo it.
So we have the trend in Dayton to underscore that of copycats. This is, and as you've reported in the past, young people, troubled young people looking back at Columbine.
Oh yeah, the Columbine killers are haunting us literally from their graves. I mean, many of these school shootings or attempted acts of violence at schools, when they go back and look at their files of the kids, look at their social media, they find a fascination with the killers of Columbine. We know for a fact that in the Newtown killing, where that young man killed all those elementary school children at Sandy Hook, that he had information about the Virginia Tech killer. He also had information about the Columbine killers. If you look at what happened in El Paso, the accused killer there, had information about the New Zealand killer who allegedly killed all those Muslim worshipers just a few months ago. And then that killer had information about the massacre at the AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina.
They feed on each other, and these troubled people are studying these incidents. Law enforcement has been telling you for years that that's a problem. And then there's the issue, of course, in El Paso of white supremacy, which has been on the rise. We talked about it extensively yesterday, but remind us again, the numbers are actually up. There's a concrete statistical showing that we're not just talking about this, we're not making it up. It's actually on the rise.
Right. The FBI tracks information about hate crimes. They've seen a surge in those numbers. Now, there's some question as to whether simply more and more law enforcement agencies are coming online to the FBI program that tracks it, and that they're simply providing more information. But however you read it, it says it's out there. It says that people are reporting acts of hate, and we know when we look at these recent spate of killings, many of them have involved people who identify with white supremacists. The Tree of Life Synagogue, as I said, the Charleston church massacre, what we just saw in El Paso. So this is real. Law enforcement officials are quite concerned about it. And again, when you throw in all the different things that the FBI is dealing with right now, it's tremendous pressure. You have ISIS, which has not gone away. You have Al-Qaeda. In some instances, there was testimony last week that they're making a resurgence. Now you throw in 850 some odd domestic terrorism cases that are open that they're pursuing, and the phenomenon of copycat killers. So very
So two trends that are very troubling. Since you're here, though, and since there's so much talk right now on background checks, I wanted to ask you about what we know about the guns in this case. Both were automatic weapons. Both were assault weapons, semi-automatic weapons, weapons of war in both cases. What do we know yet about how they were acquired? Were they legally acquired? Did both of these men pass the background checks?
Well, as far as we know, the police and authorities have said that both these weapons were bought legally. So background checks are not necessarily the be and all. The key, if you're talking to law enforcement, what they're saying is that we have to have a better system of people hearing about things or that have been written or said by the perpetrators before they act. In the same way that they go after Al-Qaeda and ISIS and try to learn about them before they act, they've got to come up with a better mechanism than currently exists to find out about these people before they act. Now, it's much more difficult when you're talking about domestic terrorism because there's no federal domestic terrorism statute that exists. And so, as an example, there's no law that allows the government to charge someone for, quote, providing material support. You know, you always hear about these cases.
Right.
We're charging someone with providing material
Before
support
the act has
to
occurred.
ISIS.
Right.
Well, there's no such law that
On the
you can
domestic
attach
side.
to KKK or neo-Nazis. It doesn't exist.
Before we let you go, very quickly, one of the things that we're seeing in Texas, we heard from Will Carr, our correspondent on the ground there in El Paso, that there has been a spike in gun purchases. People have been flocking to the gun stores there to buy guns. We see it in the Walmart there. In fact, the Walmart, after the shooting, is still continuing to sell the guns. Does that trouble law enforcement after a shooting like this? We've seen it in so many different cities. People rush out to buy up weapons, afraid that there will be backlash.
Well, look, the United States, we have the Second Amendment, which means that people can buy and own weapons. And there are some people who are purchasing weapons because they're afraid for their families, legitimately so. Sometimes you see a surge in gun sales after an attack like this because people are buying up assault rifles because they think, oh, something may be coming that we will no longer be able to purchase those. I think I recall correctly that after Sandy Hook and all those young children were murdered by that killer, that there was a massive surge around Christmas time and people buying assault rifles.
It's crazy to hear about that, and shocking, really, after so many lives lost. Pierre Thomas, thanks for all your reporting and for coming in. The president's rhetoric, the influence and the impact that it is having has been front and center, of course, in our Democratic campaign on the campaign trail for president. Democrats condemning it. Many Republicans, if quietly critical of the president, are largely standing by silent. But how are independent voters this campaign season viewing the president's rhetoric on race and racism, particularly in some of the largely white swing districts of the Midwest? Well, we were up in Detroit, Michigan last week for the debate. We caught up with voters in one of the critical independent swing districts, Macomb County, and we met Mayor Michael Taylor of Sterling Heights, a 36-year-old lawyer who supported Donald Trump in 2016, but says his rhetoric right now means he can't support the president in 2020. Here's a little of that conversation.
I think it's easy to criticize Donald Trump for the terribly, racist things he says, mean-spirited things he says. He bullies people. He calls people names. I don't like that. No person should like that. I mean, the analogy I use is, if my 9-year-old daughter was saying that at school and the principal called us, we'd be shocked, disappointed, and they'd take disciplinary action against her. So if I wouldn't abide my 9-year-old saying it, why should the president be saying it? But I'm telling you, if you think that there are a lot, another thing I'd say is, there's a lot of people here, tens of thousands of people, who are still deciding, can I pull the trigger for Trump again, or the lever for Trump again, or am I going to go with somebody on the Democratic side? And if the Democrats come and say, if you vote for Trump, you are a racist, that's not going to sit well with those voters, because they're not sure yet. They might vote for Trump. They might not vote for Trump.
Do you think some of these people see themselves in Donald Trump? They don't want to be called a racist. Maybe they think some of the things he's saying out loud.
I think sometimes, look, are there bigoted people? Are there people who hold bigoted beliefs? Sure, certainly. And I think one of my biggest criticisms is that of the president is that he gives a safe harbor for those people. And I don't think he has to come out every day and disavow white nationalism and continue to say that, but he's got to do more of it, right? He's got to make sure that those white nationalists don't have a voice and that their power doesn't increase or rise. I don't personally think that his support is based on race, or it's based on this belief that brown and black people or immigrants shouldn't be welcome here. I think it's really more based on, look, I want an economy that works for me. And this is a guy that, even though he's a billionaire from New York City, he gets it, and he talks to me.
The View from Macomb County, Michigan. Mayor Michael Taylor, our thanks to him. Meanwhile, the 2020 Democrats are out in force today talking about the tragedies in both El Paso and Dayton. Donald Trump's rhetoric. A short time ago, former Vice President Joe Biden took the stage at an event in Iowa, giving a fiery attack on the president for his rhetoric and saying he is fanning the flames of white supremacy in this nation.
Trump offers no moral leadership. Seems to have no interest in unifying this nation. No evidence that the presidency has awakened his conscience in the least. Indeed, we have a president with a toxic tongue who has publicly and unapologetically embraced the political strategy of hate, racism, and division.
Let's go now to our political reporter Jeff Cook on the ground in El Paso, Texas. He's been following former Congressman Beto O'Rourke around his hometown today. Jeff, great to see you. So first I just want to ask you, Jeff, and I know the music's playing there, but just can you give us a sense of whether the people there who are still struggling to come to grips with the tragedy are talking about Donald Trump's rhetoric? Is that something that is being tossed about right now, or is the focus really just on grieving?
You know, the first 3 days or so after the attack, this community was really focused on grieving, but there seemed to be a shift today in focusing on action. This rally behind me is pretty focused on how they're going to attack the Republican Party and Donald Trump to keep this from happening again. Most of the signs out here say things targeting the president. Today we talked to former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, and he said that he's canceling his appearance at the Iowa State Fair in order to remain in the community for several more days.
He's going to be down there, indeed, basically taking himself off the trail, Jeff. Beto has also had some pretty strong words for the president. I know we don't have any sound queued up, but does he plan to meet the president or be near the president when he comes to his city today?
No, as of now, so far, he's going to stick to community events like this. He's not expected to meet with the president today. Earlier this morning, the president did target the former Texas congressman and making fun of his name and saying that he should be quiet. And Beto O'Rourke responded by saying that he won't be silent and the community won't be silent either.
Yeah, he certainly won't. And I think that tweet right there, we have it up right now, from President Trump this morning, was shocking to a lot of people as he prepares to, as he travels to these two cities and talks about wanting to be a uniter rather than a divider. Thanks, Jeff. Stand by. I want to come back to you. I want to go now to Justin Gomez. He's with Cory Booker down in South Carolina, visited the site of another horrific race-based mass shooting today, the Emmanuel AME Church. Justin, what was Cory Booker's message there about President Trump and this rhetoric?
Devin, Senator Booker this morning really put out a message for people to just go to action, to stop staying quiet about racism and actually speak to your neighbors, speak to everyone around you about the issue. He said if you're staying quiet about it, the problem is never going to be resolved. The senator also took aim subtly at President Trump, calling him out for his tweets, his rhetoric on the campaign trail, as we've seen some of the other 2020 Democrats have done. Now, I've been with the senator for the past 3 days here in South Carolina, and this is something that is definitely on voters' mind. It's been brought up at every town hall and meet and greet that he's done here. So this issue, once again, front and center in the presidential campaign.
Yeah, let's take a listen, Justin, to some of what Cory Booker had to say today at that Mother Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina.
The act of anti-Latino, anti-immigrant hatred we witnessed this past weekend did not start with the hand that pulled the trigger. It did not begin when a single white supremacist got into his car to travel 10 hours to kill as many human beings as he could. It was planted in fertile soil because the contradictions that have shadowed this country since its founding remain a part of our body politic. It was sowed from the highest office in our land, where we see in tweets and rhetoric hateful words that ultimately endanger the lives of people in our country. Can't love your country unless you love your fellow country, man and woman, all of them.
And Justin, real quickly back to you. We've seen such an array of gun violence, gun safety proposals from all the candidates. They came up in the debate last week. You and I were talking about it there in Detroit. Remind us where Cory Booker stands on this, because he's been, again, re-upping his proposal to counter some of the violence we've seen in so many cities.
yeah, the senator is a very big advocate for gun control legislation. This morning he called for increased background checks in general to close some of those loopholes. He also wants the DOJ, the FBI, and Homeland Security to be able to investigate domestic terrorism, to study it as well. And he just is calling for a lot of common sense gun reform that he's been pitching along the campaign trail. And if I could, just one more thing that stood out, he was just very passionate this morning. And one line that really stood out, he asked people, I'm going to quote this, he asked, if the answer to the question, do racism and white supremacy exist, is yes, then the real question isn't who is or isn't a racist, but who is or isn't doing something about it. If there was one quote that really sums up everything that happened inside that church this morning, that is it. He's really wanting people to go out there and be active to condemn everything that's happening.
Justin Gomez, our political reporter on the Booker campaign down there in South Carolina. Thanks a lot, Justin. I want to bring Jeff Cook back in. He's down in El Paso covering events there and, of course, Beto O'Rourke. And to pick up, Jeff, where Justin left off there are so many calls now for people to do something about it. And one of the other candidates that you cover in this race, Joaquin Castro, his brother, Joaquin Castro, a congressman who stirred up some controversy overnight. I want to ask you about it. Let's put up this tweet. He says we all need to shine a spotlight on people who support financially this hateful rhetoric and shine a spotlight on it. He has tweeted out the names of 44 donors to Donald Trump in the state of Texas, says their contributions are fueling a campaign of hate that labels Hispanic immigrants as invaders. That has really drawn a lot of blowback from Republicans, Jeff.
I just want to say...
Yeah, it certainly has. Republicans on the Hill, Republicans around the country were pretty unhappy about Joaquin Castro, the congressman and twin brother of Julian Castro, and also serves as chairman of his presidential campaign. Of course, Beto O'Rourke has come out saying that in targeting the people who he says are complicit in supporting the president and who he says is partially to blame for incidents like we saw in El Paso just a few days ago. But Joaquin Castro went a little bit farther, as he said, by publishing the names. Now, they are publicly available, but putting them on Twitter, the names of San Antonio business leaders, even homemaker retirees who have donated the maximum amount to the president this year.
It's certainly been done by both sides, shining the spotlight, putting those donors out there, but certainly makes those donors very uncomfortable. We'll see if that's part of the solution to all this, shining a spotlight. Jeff Cook, thanks for your reporting from El Paso, Texas. And thank you all for watching the briefing room here today. A lot to cover with these two shootings. We'll be back here tomorrow, 3:30 Eastern Time, continuing live coverage of all the fallout from the situation in El Paso and Dayton, Texas, here on ABC News Live and on the ABC News app. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Hope to see you back here tomorrow.